$126,000 a year. That is the income per person in Qatar. The same number for the United States is 86,000. And here is the second number. 7 in 10 people in Qatar are men. Not 51%. 71. Somebody here got rich. Somebody else poured the concrete. This film is about which of the two the number belongs to. Qatar is a low sandbar in the Persian Gulf, about the size of Connecticut. No rivers, almost no rain. In 1960, 36,000 people lived on it. A town. Today there are close to 3 million, and roughly 3/4 of them were born somewhere else. They arrive with a contract and a flight number. They pour a stadium, a metro line, a skyline that did not exist inside a single lifetime. And when the contract ends, they go home. The income per person is calculated across all of them. The country belongs to almost none of them. There are two questions in this story, and they do not have the same answer. The first one is mechanical. How does a sandbar with no rivers, no farmland, and 36,000 people end up with the highest output per head in the world? That answer is under the water, and we will have it inside 10 minutes. The second question is the one that does not let go. In October 2021, Qatar held the first legislative election in its history. 30 of the 45 seats on the Shura Council were put to a vote. 63.5% of eligible voters turned out. 3 years later, in November 2024, Qatar held a referendum and voted to take those seats back. 90.6% said yes. All 45 members are appointed by the Emir again. So, how do you get that rich? And why did the one election that country ever held turn out to be the thing it could not survive? Hold on to the second one. It does not close until the end. The answer to the first question is a gas field. In 1971, a survey off the northeast coast found a structure under the seabed that turned out to be the largest single natural gas field on the planet. Qatar called it the North Field. For 25 years, it was close to worthless because gas is a nuisance. Oil you can put in a barrel and load onto a ship. Gas you cannot. Gas has to be piped to a customer, and Qatar's customers were an ocean away. So Qatar did the expensive thing. It built plants that chill gas to minus 162 degrees Celsius, at which point it turns to liquid and shrinks to a 600th of its volume, and it can be poured into a ship like any other cargo. The first cargo sailed in December 1996 to Japan. By 2025, Qatar was shipping 81.5 million tons a year, about 18.7% of everything traded in the world, second only to the United States. In 1970, the entire economy of Qatar was worth $302 million. In 2024, was worth $216 billion. That is 700 times larger inside one working life. But the machine that does this has a detail nobody planned for. Liquefying gas takes plants, ports, roads, power stations, housing, and the men to build them. And in 1990, the entire country contained 440,000 people of every age of both sexes. There was nobody to build it with. So picture the man who solves that problem for them, because there are 2.5 million versions of him, and the system runs on his arithmetic, not on Qatar's. He is 26. He is from a district in Nepal, or Kerala, or Bihar, or the north of Bangladesh. A recruiter in a small office in his hometown shows him a contract in a language he reads slowly. The wage on the paper is the reason he signs. Back home, the same year's work would pay a fraction of it. What the paper does not itemize is the fee he pays that recruiter to be allowed to sign, which is often more money than he has ever held at once, and which he borrows. So before he has laid a single curbstone, he owes 2 years, he tells himself. 2 years, and the loan is gone, and everything after that is the house. That is the sentence in his head, in his own language, and it is the sentence that holds the whole system together. Not force, debt, and a plane ticket, and a number on a page that is bigger than the number at home. He lands in Doha at 3 in the morning because the cheap flights arrive at 3 in the morning. The heat comes through the jet bridge like something with a weight. And the first thing that happens before the bus, before the accommodation block, before the first shift, is that somebody takes his passport. The passport is the first rung. It is not, in itself, the system. The system has a name, kafala, and it is older than the gas. Under it, a foreign worker does not have a visa that belongs to him. He has a sponsor, and the sponsor is his employer, and the two facts are welded together. If he leaves the employer, he loses the right to be in the country. So he cannot resign. He can only be released. And here's the rung that matters most, the one every account keeps coming back to. To change jobs, he needed a no-objection certificate, a signed letter from the employer he is trying to leave, saying they do not object to him leaving. Read that again. The permission to escape a bad employer had to be granted by the bad employer. Second rung, the debt. He owes the recruiter at home, and the loan is usually secured against the only thing his family has, which is land or a house. So the first year of wages is not wages. It is repayment, which means that on the day he discovers the accommodation block has 8 men to a room, or that the wage is lower than the paper said, or that the paper he signed at home has been replaced by a different paper in Doha. Walking away is not a choice he owns. Third rung, the heat. Doha in July is regularly over 40 degrees Celsius, with humidity off the Gulf. And until 2021, the summer working ban was a fixed midday window on a calendar, not a rule that responded to what the actual temperature was doing. Fourth rung, wages that arrive late or not at all, which is the most common complaint in every survey of the workforce, in which the state eventually answered with an electronic wage protection system that pays through banks, so the transfer is on a record. Every one of those rungs got a fix. That is the honest part of this story, and it will matter later. But look at the shape of the fixes. Each one repairs the rung above it and leaves the ladder standing. The NOC gets abolished, and the man still cannot vote on the law that abolished it. The minimum wage gets set, and it is set for him, not by him. Somebody decides for 2.5 million people, and the 2.5 million are not in the room. Which brings us to the arithmetic that makes this country different from every other rich country on earth. Imagine your country. Take the whole population, every baby, every school child, every retired person, everyone in a hospital bed. Now, count how many of them go to work. In the United States, that number is about half. Half the people work, and their work carries the other half. And that ratio is roughly what a normal country looks like, because a normal country contains childhoods and old age. Now do Qatar. Population, 2.9 million. Labor force, 2.1 million. 3/4 of everyone in the country is in the workforce. Not 3/4 of adults. 3/4 of the people. And that number is not an achievement. It is a confession. It tells you the population has been filtered, that the children and the grandparents and the retirements were left in another country, and what was imported was the working years only, and then sent home when they stopped. That is also why 7 in 10 people there are men, and why in 2008, at the peak of construction, it was more than 3 in 4. There is no country on earth with a natural sex ratio like that. You cannot be born into it. You can only be shipped into it. And now put the income number back on top. $126,000 per person per year, divided across a population that was assembled on purpose out of people in their working years who are not allowed to stay. Here is the first chart in this film, and it is not the one you expect. This is income per person adjusted for what money buys locally from 1990 to today. Qatar is the line at the top. In 2012, it touches $181,000 per person, the highest figure any populated country has ever posted. And then it falls. By 2020, it is 82,000. Less than half. Nothing was destroyed. No war, no default, no collapse. The gas kept selling. Here is what happened. The denominator moved. Between 2005 and 2015, Qatar's population went from 825,000 to 2.3 million. It tripled in 10 years because that is how many men it takes to build a country from sandbar. Every arriving worker adds a little to the top of the fraction and a whole person to the bottom. So the average per head falls even while the economy grows, which exposes what income per person actually is. It is not a wage. Nobody is paid it. It is a fraction, and Qatar's fraction has a numerator earned by gas and a denominator made of men who will not be there in 10 years. Norway is the useful comparison, and it is on this chart too. Same idea. Hydrocarbons, small population, sovereign fund. But Norway's denominator is Norwegians, who vote, retire there, and are buried there. Qatar's denominator is rented. On the 2nd of December 2010, in a hall in Zurich, FIFA opened an envelope. Qatar had beaten the United States 14 votes to 8 to host the 2022 World Cup. A country of 1.6 million people, where summer temperatures passed 40 degrees, had won the largest event on the sporting calendar. And in that moment, something happened to Qatar that gas had never done to it. It became visible, because a World Cup is not a gas plant. A gas plant is behind a fence in an industrial zone, and no camera crew from Europe ever asks to see it. A World Cup has 8 stadiums, a new metro, an entire new city, and a decade of journalists with a reason to fly in. Qatari officials have put the total infrastructure spend at around $200 billion. The Secretary General of the organizing committee said that figure publicly more than once. And so, for the first time, the men on the scaffolding had an audience. In February 2021, The Guardian published an investigation that used the death records of 5 countries: India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and reported that more than 6,500 of their nationals had died in Qatar between 2010 and 2020. Qatar's response was that the number is real, but the framing is wrong. Those are all deaths of every cause across the entire foreign population and the whole economy, over 10 years, not deaths on World Cup sites. On the World Cup stadium sites specifically, the organizing committee's own figure was 3 work-related deaths and 37 non-work-related deaths. Both of those numbers are on a record. They are answers to different questions, which is exactly why the argument never resolved. And notice what neither number tells you, because no number in this fight tells you how a young man dies of natural causes in the summer at 30 on a construction site. And then Qatar did something the story does not usually allow for. It changed the law. On the 30th of August, 2020, the Emir signed 3 of them, and they entered force on the 8th of September. Law 19 abolished the no objection certificate. From that date, a worker could change employer without his current employer's signature, the single rung that had held the whole ladder. Law 18 rewrote notice periods. Law 17 set a minimum wage that applied to every worker in the country regardless of nationality. 1,000 riyals a month in basic pay, plus 500 for housing and 300 for food if the employer does not provide them. It took effect in March 2021. The International Labor Organization, not a body that hands out compliments in this region, called it a milestone, and it was the first non-discriminatory minimum wage in the Gulf. So the fix is real. Now, put the fix next to the arithmetic. As of 2023, by Qatar's own labor force survey, the country had 2.18 million economically active people, and 2.06 million of them were not Qatari. 94%. The ILO put it in a sentence: for every Qatari in the labor force, there are 23 non-Qataris. Every one of those reforms was written for that 94%. Not one of them was written by it. And that is the error at the center of this story, not a cruelty and engineering error. A country had built a workforce 23 times larger than itself, and then had to decide what political rights meant in a place where the people who do the work can never become the people who decide. Qatar's answer in 2021 was to try an election. Saturday, the 2nd of October, 2021. Polling stations open across Qatar for the first time in the country's history. 30 of the 45 seats on the Shura Council are being elected. The Emir will still appoint the other 15. More than 200 candidates are standing. Turnout, when the Ministry of Interior announces it, is 63.5%, a respectable number in any democracy. Not one woman wins a seat. 2 are appointed afterwards. Now, the question that decides everything about that day. Who is allowed to vote? Not the 2.5 million foreign workers. That part is not surprising. Almost no country lets non-citizens vote in national elections. The surprise is inside the citizens. Electoral Law Number 6 of 2021 says a voter must be a citizen of original Qatari nationality, or, if naturalized, must have a paternal grandfather who was born in Qatar. So the electorate was not defined as Qataris. It was defined by descent, and the line was drawn at roughly 1930 before the oil, which meant that thousands of people holding Qatari passports, most visibly members of the Al Murra tribe, a group with deep roots on both sides of the Saudi border, found that they were citizens who could not vote. There is no published official count of eligible voters. There is no published official count of Qatari citizens either. Independent estimates put them at 11 or 12% of the population. So on the day Qatar held its first election, the ballot was open to a fraction of a fraction. Roughly 1 in 10 people in the country were citizens, and not even all of them qualified. And that is where the story turns one last time, because the thing that killed the election was not the 2.5 million people excluded from it. It was the 12% who were let in. An election needs an electorate, and an electorate needs a boundary. And the moment Qatar drew that boundary, it had to say out loud which families were inside it and which were not. In a country where citizenship, housing, jobs, and cash benefits all flow from the state, that line is not symbolic. It is the whole inheritance. So the campaign of 2021 turned into a contest between families and tribes about who was really Qatari, which is precisely what a monarchy built on tribal balance cannot afford. On the 15th of October, 2024, the Emir announced he would put a constitutional amendment to the people. And he said why. The elections, he said, had taken on, his words, an identity-based character that we are not equipped to handle. On the 5th of November, 2024, Qatar voted. 90.6% said yes. The articles providing for elected seats were struck out of the Constitution. All 45 members of the Shura Council are appointed by the Emir. Look at what that referendum actually was. It is the only time in Qatar's history that the population has been asked a direct political question, and the question was whether to stop asking. Now, look at the chart, because this is the shape underneath all of it. In 1960, Qatar was 51% male, an ordinary population, families, children, grandparents. The same as anywhere. Then the gas plants start, and the line climbs, and by 2008, more than 3 in 4 people in the country are men. That line is not demography. That line is a labor import schedule. A country that shape cannot become a democracy without becoming a different country. And that is the trade that was made quietly and then in 2024 out loud. So here is the answer to the question left open at the start. Qatar held one election and then voted never to hold another, because an election forced the country to define who counts. And in a place where 9 in 10 residents are there on a contract, that definition is the one thing the state cannot survive saying out loud. The gas answered the first question. The second one was never really about voting. It was about arithmetic that no constitution has been written for. Today, Qatar's population is a little over 3.2 million, the highest it has ever been. It is the world's second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. The income per person will be published again next year, and it will be enormous, and every serious newspaper will print it next to the name of country. That number has a numerator earned from a field found in 1971, and a denominator made of people who are counted when the average is taken and not counted when anything is decided. That is not a Qatari invention, by the way. It is only clearer there than anywhere else, because the ratio is extreme enough to see. Every rich country runs on somebody who is inside the economy and outside the politics. Qatar just built the version you can measure.